because just in the same way as Karen finished, I would add that currently what was important in the last words was how do we know God's way? And here an essential element is God's word. Now you mentioned about science, and that some say that sciences were known to humans by wahi, which means texture, revelation in words. And then you said something about ilham. Now ilham also is divine inspiration, no doubt. Very important in the Shiite context, where the knowledge of imams apparently appears to be received by them through ilham, which means some kind of divine inspiration, which is not textual. Also, I found at the time in commentaries by Yefet Benelli, the Karaite of the 10th century, who says that the basic elements of science were given by God through the process of ilham, of revelation, which, I mean, people couldn't know anything about science without this starting point, which they received by ilham. And now, I don't like to say that the floor is open because this reminds me always of Korach. But anyway, you are now. Yes.
Thank you very much for all the speakers. I'd like to refer to Shai's presentation. I'd like to suggest further thoughts about what you termed, your student term. And you spoke about systematization, and I wonder if you would also make the distinction between systematization and historization, which talk about Shreir Gaon. Right? Shreir Gaon, both ways are aiming to organize traditional content. Not necessarily the same way. You can also think about Seder Tanaim Amoraim, which preceded Shreir Gaon, but this is something much more systematic in terms of how to apply principles. Shreir Gaon, in many ways, is trying to bring an order in historical way. When he says, for example, Sof Mishnah, by the way, I'm not sure that Mishnah is a designated corpus of laws. For him, Sof Mishnah, at least my intuition, is that it's an ending of a period. That's why Rabbi Natan and Rabbi, which Rabbi Natan has nothing to do with the Mishnah, obviously. And likewise with Sofer Ah. By the way, Saadia Gaon also does this kind of periodization in Sefer HaGalui, in the way that he also, and it goes back actually also to Christian ideas about periodization vis-a-vis the law. There is the old law, there is the new law, there is the future to be without law, without being under the law, whatever that be. So I think it's part of a major, much broader idea about organizing the law within historical periodization. This is one thing. By the way, regarding the Mishnah, recently there were some discussions by Pete van Boxel and Amnon Ras-Karkotsky. Apparently, except to two exceptions in medieval time, Maimonides and Rav Shimon Mishantz, we have no evidence that the Mishnah was studied as a book. Even though the Karaites, they describe the Rabbanites as a Halal Mishnah. But Mishnah for them is a token. Right? It's a symbol, it's not. Now, regarding canonization, I'd like to suggest another distinction. First of all, you could think about canonization as something that is related to some establishment, political power, going back to the common law, right? When Justinian says, this is the corpus juris civilis, this is canonized. When the rabbis, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, when they canonize the Mishnah, it's in a way self-canonization. They declare about the Mishnah as the representation of the law, and they ascribe to this canonized status. And this is also different from an external canonization, like the Gaonites had. When they say the Talmud is canonized, they stay outside the canon. In that regard, canonization of that kind of law is not only about ascribing authority to this law, but also to deliberate themselves. And the best example is Maimonides, of course. When he says, the Talmud, we don't contradict the Talmud, is actually saying, but nevertheless, something which is not stated clearly in the Talmud, we can disagree about that, and we could pick our own personal opinions. So sometimes canonization could be a way to deliberate yourself from tradition. And another last comment about the sealing. You spoke about the sealing of the Mishnah, sealing of prophecy. I would also think about the closing the gate of Ijtihad, which is also sealing an historical event which seals its past period. As Guy Strunz showed, actually, the sealing, the person who seals historical period goes back also to ancient Gnostic texts. And that's, again, the way that the person is singling a period. It's a very interesting word. Yeah. But immediately.
Yeah. So yeah, I definitely agree that the opening paragraph where I described this process of systematization, canonization, I was referring to many different processes, which I'm going to include in separate studies. I kind of focused on a specific notion of canonization in this talk, but I agree with you, the historical periodization is very important in this context. And we find very similar ideas going on in the, for instance, in one of the texts I brought from the Zoroastrian tradition, we also have this historicization of the transmission of the law. We have right, the Achaemenids, and then the Parthians, and then the Sasanians, and vis-a-vis the canonization of Avesta Zan, which is very similar to what's going on in Sof Mishnah, which you mentioned, Sedel Tanaim V'Amoraim, and so on. Now, there are other interrelated processes that are going on here. One of the most important things, which I didn't mention, but it's directly related to this issue, is the self-perception of the sages. Are we part of the legislative process? Are we still legislators? Are we part of the Talmud, or are we creating the sense of distance from the Talmud, and therefore our role is simply to interpret, transmit, but not to perhaps to adjudicate according to this closed corpus, but we're not part of the legislative process. This is a very important thing that is similarly going on, and has to do with the development of Klali Psika in the Gaonic period, and so on and so forth. So this is obviously a very broad process which I'm talking about, and therefore I use these terms, systematization, canonization, but we're really referring to many different processes that are overlapping and intersecting in various ways.
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to get more clarity about what exactly the point is, because in a way you claim that at a specific historical period there is a cross-pollination between different ways of canonization within the Zoroastrian, the Muslim and the Jewish tradition. And on the other hand, we had contributions from different periods where basically the main claim is that canonization is a phenomenon that comes all the time, pops up throughout history in different contexts. We have canonization related to curricula, to institutions, to school of law, school of thought, science, whatever. So canonization is omnipresent all the time. And so in this context, it seemed to me that it would be more useful to actually stress what are the particularities of each canonization you are comparing. By basically bringing them together and showing similarities, it loses its quality in some time. So I would be more interested to work out what is specific about each of the canonization. I mean, what is different between the canonization of the Corpus Hermeticum and the Chaldean oracles and about so the school of Antioch, and I mean, you know, each one has its peculiarities, and that's what's interesting, not that canonization is.
So unless there is a lesson that you want to draw from this comparison, and what is the lesson?
So I can't agree more about, assume the similarities, explain the differences, and there are many differences. What I tried to stress in this talk was the fact that, like you're saying, canonization is omnipresent, right? For instance, right, the Mishnah was, in a certain sense, was canonized way before the Gaonic period, right? It was situated as the main source of Talmudic exegesis, right? The Talmud is an interpretation of the Mishnah. However, what we have here is something very explicit, which I think differs from previous periods. We have a very explicit and overt notion of canonization. We're actually talking about the history, mapping out this canonization onto historical processes. We're showing how superimposing, right, on history, the idea that Rav Ashi and Ravina, right, redacted the Talmud is not an historical truth in itself. We needed Rav Shira Gaon to come and tell us this story. It's a narrative that is created, and what I think the interesting point of similarity here is that a similar narrative is created and imposed on history. So for instance, this council that I described in the 6th century, once again, probably not even an historical event, really explicates this process of canonization.
So just one, I think, note on some of the other comments to respond to Ishai and suggest that Shafi's canonization, if you will, does open up the door to exegesis. So in some sense, the narrowing allows for a broadening, right? And so, and another thing that came to mind, of course, is the narratives about in the letter of Aristeas, where, right, there is a ruler involved and so on. So like this could just be a theme and a trope in how canonization works generally. So.
No, this is very important because it talks about the canonization of the Mishnah, for instance. And we know that in the time of the Gaonim, every class in the yeshiva was opened with a quotation of one particular Mishnah. And then you have all the discussions about the exact wording of the Mishnah. This is exactly what the meaning of canonization and opening it the door for exegesis. This is more or less this includes all these elements. Yes, please.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is how a community relates to a certain corpus of texts and how under which conditions this actually changes in time, because then we can try to find out more about what is the relation between the community and the context and how does something new come into the world, so to say, a new interpretation, a new idea, although the legal or the normative religious text corpus remains the same more or less, but it adds on through a different context and interpretation. So I agree with Gregor. I think this would be interesting. Well, I mean, the presentation was about comparing similarities in different historical, cultural contexts, but to deepen each dimension would be important to stretch, to focus on the conditions of this of the process of change.
Okay.
So, Yishai, in your paper, you mentioned canonization and systematization. And I was wondering if you could just say a word about the relationship between those two, because they don't seem obviously related. That is, one can canonize something that's quite unsystematic. And of course, we know of instances of that. And one can systemize some things that are not canonized. I think of, say, in Roman law, Gaius' Institutes, which did systematize, but did not have canonical status. So what is there, can you say something about the nature of the systematization and the relationship between that and canonization and these traditions that you're looking at?
Systematization, I was referring to something I haven't been talking about, which is assigning specific realms of law, differentiating, writing treatises on specific legal topics, and so on and so forth. That's a separate process, which I think is part of this overall image that I'm trying to portray. So canonization is definitely very different than systematization of the law. I also refer to abstraction, which is a fascinating topic in itself. This is something that begins with in the Babylonian Talmud, or the late Sasanian period, and goes on into the Gaonic period. It's something that we find in, obviously, in Islamic law and even in Zoroastrian literature, abstracting these legal principles and so on. I could give a few examples. If, for instance, this is one thing I was working on, and this includes Christian literature as well. Ishobocht, in the 8th century, translates, he wrote his Corpus Juris in Middle Persian, but it was translated into Syriac. It's basically the first attempt of the East Syrian church to create a civil law. And he, some of the terms there remain in their original, transliterated form of the Middle Persian. So one of the terms, for instance, Medadestani, okay, which means the greater law, literally, and actually means going beyond the minimum requirements of the law, performing extra. Now, this term has a history in Zoroastrian literature, obviously, but it corresponds with similar developments in Gaonic literature on the use of Lifnim Mishuat Adin, right, and so on. So these are the types of abstraction that I'm thinking about. So once again, systematization, I'm referring to really defining different realms of the law, and canonization is what we were talking about, and then there's abstraction. But all these intersect in many ways.
About the relationship between canonization and theology. So, the one to canonize the text, it can be based on several arguments. It can argue that the author has some special abilities, and the text has some special quality, and another argument is the text is a reflection of God's will. But my question is what is the essence of this theological argument? Is it only rhetorical, rhetoric? But no more than that, or it gives something substantive to the process of canonization?
I think, to the extent that we're talking about divine revelation, or capturing divine revelation in textual form, be it Zand or Torah Sheba'al Peh, so there's definitely an added dimension to the theology here. The fact that we're not just legally canonizing. The fact that, right, Ravashi or Rebbe or whatever were inspired by God, and in some way God orchestrated this process, because ultimately this is the capturing, the textual capturing of divine revelation. So I think and even the distancing, where the Geonim, where the post-Sasanian Zoroastrian sages, come and say we're no longer part of the legislative process. Sofo ra'ah, right? We're just using this corpus to adjudicate actual disputes, or we interpret it, we transmit it. So in a sense, it's much more than the idea of constitution, for instance. In contemporaneous discourse. The theological element, I think, adds a lot to the discussion.
Much more in terms of quality or quantity, to use terms from there.
The quality, the way the text is perceived. Although, you know, obviously, the American Constitution, for instance, is religious in some, you know, in some sense. So I guess these processes are cross-cultural. But here, there's definitely an added dimension of divine revelation in a real concrete sense.
Just, Karen, you were speaking about prophecy and science, and I just thought that even in our rational thinkers like Maimonides, you see that the active intellect plays a very big role in for scientists, right? I mean, it reaches them, and there are things that they cannot even reach via rigorous logical processes, and they get it from the active intellect. So there is some kind of a role, a funny role, of prophecy in science, and prophets are the perfect scientists, right? In his description. So we have something in common still.
No,
Even among
the story about
rationalists.
the active intellect.
Huh?
The story about the active intellect. It may be, I mean, it may be somehow connected, but you know, yes, Ibn Sina had this theory about hadas or hads, which means intuition, by which maybe a philosopher, a scientist knows things intuitively without any study, which is somehow maybe compared to the process of prophecy, maybe.
But in 237, Maimonides is very clear that there is an active intellect that comes to the rational faculty, then goes to the imaginative faculty, and the prophecy is both of them are perfect, right? And so there is some element there of prophecy in the acquisition of science.
Tried to be compared to the like Ibn Sina, but
Yeah, he
probably
draws
was.
prophecy.
Yes.
Huh?
He gave you a tip for Hades.
You tell me.
Yes. Okay. Thank you again very much to our panel, and also to the discussants. We had a very illuminating session. Thank you.